The previous video showed how to keep data in memory, preventing it from being lost after calling another object, and then return to the first one. To do this, we created a web session type variable and saved in it the data we were interested in, which, in this case, included the values of the 3 available filters. We decided to save this data in the event update.click using the set method of the session variable to later retrieve them in the start event through the get method of the web session variable. This was a solution made in our own way, and as promised in the previous video, let's now see how the work with pattern of the attraction transaction does it automatically. Remember that in this work with automatically generated by Genexus, when you enter values in the filters and then update some record from the update action, the values are kept when retrieved. To see how this is done, we'll access the WW attraction object and then its events section. Note that a subroutine called save grid state has been generated. A subroutine is a block of code which is identified by a name and can then be run within the same object. Subroutines are defined using the sub command. One of the advantages of subroutines is that they make the code clearer and easier to read. Another great advantage is that they allow reusing the block of code declared within it. This way, if you need to execute the same block of code from several places in the object, we can write it only once, and it can be invoked from several locations using the do command. We'll see this in a moment. Let's focus on the next section of this subroutine code, which is what we're interested in now. First of all, note that a variable called gridState and another one called gridStateFilterValue have been created. Note how they've been declared from the variables section. And note that gridState is of gridState type, and gridStateFilterValue is of gridState.filterValue type. What do these types make reference to? If we consider the objects in the KB, they make reference to an object of SDT type, which was automatically generated by Genexus when the workwith was created. Let's see the structure of this SDT. Its main structure is made up of 3 members: current page, ordered by, and hiding search. All 3 are of numeric type. Also note that there's a substructure called filter value, which will be a collection. Within this substructure, a member called value of varchar type has been declared. Let's go back to the events section of the WW attraction object. Within the code we're interested in, note that the first line stores, in the current page member of the grid state variable, the number of the grid page that we're in. In this case, there was no paging in the grid. However, if in this work with we configured the row property of the grid and set a value for it, such as 5, what we'll say here is that we want to show 5 rows per page. When updating, we see that only the first 5 elements will appear, and then it'll give the option to advance the page to see the remaining data. In that case, we would also be interested in saving the page on which we were positioned. This is why the pattern does it, to cover that scenario. The order applied to the data will be saved in the next line, in the ordered by member of the grid state SDT. Then, with the clear method, any data loaded in the filter values collection will be deleted. Now the grid state filter value variable will be displayed in action. As we've seen, it's of the grid state type, pointing to the filter value substructure. First of all, it's assigned the new operator, which returns a new initialized instance of the SDT variable, so that a value can be loaded in it later. This is done in the value member, assigning it the attraction name variable, which is the one used by the work with to enter the filter by name. This variable is then added to the filter values collection. The same procedure is repeated again, but in this case with the country name variable, which will contain the value of the filter by country name. Next, note there's a variable named session. And if you go to the variable section, you'll see that it's of the web session type. This variable will store the data collected in the previous lines. For this, the set method will be used on the session variable, passing it a key and a value through parameters. As a key, it'll use the value of the variable program name concatenated with the text grid state. Program name is a variable that stores the name of the active program. That is to say, the name indicated in the object name property. In this case, it's WW attraction. As a value, it'll save the grid state variable. As we've seen, it's of the SDT type and where the data you want to store was saved. Now, note where the invocation to this subroutine is made. That is, the moment in which it will be used. It's called using the do command in the refresh event. Every time this event is triggered, the values of the desired filters will be saved. In the previous video, for the solution in the web panel, we thought about saving the filter values in this event. And we decided it wasn't the best moment because every time the refresh event is triggered, these values will be saved. Maybe we're not interested in saving them because it won't be necessary to retrieve them later. And yet, we're saving them again and again. For example, every time the value of one filter is changed, this event is triggered and these values will be saved. The pattern does it this way precisely because it's a pattern, and as a result, it addresses all possible situations. Since the pattern doesn't know exactly what we're going to use the application for, it covers all possible scenarios. Now let's see how and where this information we saved will be retrieved. Note that another subroutine called load grid state has been generated. Here's where the information saved in the save grid state subroutine will be retrieved. In this line, the information previously saved in the session variable will be loaded in the grid state variable, which is of SDT type. This is done through the from XML method, which receives an XML string from where the information is loaded in the SDT object. This method will receive in a parameter the location from where the data is to be retrieved, which in this case will be the session variable. Note that it uses the get method to indicate the value to retrieve using the key that was saved for it. Remember that the key assigned to save the data was the sequence of the program name variable. This is to say, the name of the object plus the grid state text string. Then we see that several checks are made using if commands. This section verifies that the ordered by member of this SDT variable is different from 0. In other words, it checks if there is any saved order to find out if it's necessary to retrieve it or not. If it's different from 0, it retrieves this information saved in a variable called ordered by. Then, it checks if the number of data items stored in the filter values collection is greater than or equal to 2. This value is assigned because there are 2 filters in the work with. It checks that this data is saved to be retrieved later. This block of code is where the filter values will be retrieved. The filter of the attraction name will be saved in the attraction name variable through the from string method. The same happens with the country name filter, saving the value in the country name variable. The last thing to check is whether the current page member used to save the grid page is greater than 0. If so, it retrieves that value and assigns it directly to the current page property of the grid. So, when will the subroutine be called? As discussed, when creating our own web panel, the only time possible will be at the start event. This event is run only once when the website is first loaded. Another difference between this object and the one we created can be seen in the load event of the grid. To update the information of a grid record, both our web panel and the one generated by the pattern, the update variable, is used. Clicking on it takes us to the corresponding screen, which in this case is the attraction transaction in update mode. Let's remember how we implemented it in our web panel. We did it inside the update.click event, invoking the attraction transaction directly, passing it by parameter, the mode to execute, and the attraction ID. The pattern does it in the grid.load event, which will be executed as many times as records are to be loaded in the grid. Note that the pattern applied the link property to the update variable, and then it indicates that this value will be equal to the link function of the attraction transaction, passing by parameter the mode in which we want to execute this transaction and the ID that identifies it, in this case, attraction ID. In other words, it associates the link function with the link property of the variable, and as a result, when you click on this variable, the call to the attraction web object is made. Although we're not providing an example, the same thing is done with the delete variable, passing the corresponding mode as a parameter. In this case, both ways of implementing it will have the same functionality. When you click on the update variable, in both options, the attraction object will be called. This indicates that we want to make an update, passing it the ID of the selected element, so that all the data can be loaded on the screen from this key. As we can see, for the invocation of other web objects, it'll be possible to use both the parameter and link function as the direct invocation of the object. While you can use either option in this example, there are differences between them. For example, if the object we want to call is a procedure, we can only do it by directly invoking the object's name. On the other hand, to make reference to a static HTML page, for example, the link function must be used. Now let's go back to the events section of the web panel. Let's try and practice using the subroutines we've just seen in the same way we use them in the work with. Thus, we'll have a cleaner code, and it'll be possible to reuse those subroutines in some other event within the same object as needed. First, let's create the subroutine to save the filter data. To do this, we'll use the sub command and give it the same name that was assigned to it by the work with. Save grid state. Now, we place in it the previously created code that we programmed in the update.click event, where we assign the set methods to the web session variable, passing each variable as a key and value. Then we do the same, but with the load grid state subroutine. Here we'll retrieve the values by passing a key to it, and that value is assigned to each filter variable. So far, this was located in the start event. Now you would only have to call those subroutines from the corresponding events. In the case of the save grid state subroutine, we'll call it in the event update.click for the reasons explained in the previous video. However, we saw that if we do it from the refresh event, since it's generated by the work with automatically, it'll also meet our requirements. Now, where should we place the call to the load grid state subroutine? As discussed, it'll be in the start event. In this way, we've made a mix between how we had implemented it in our way at the beginning and how the work with implements it automatically. In addition, we could also implement it with an SDT object and a variable of this data type in the same way the pattern does. While we're not going to do that in this example, it would be a good practice that after this video, you try it yourself. Keeping the filters between screen runs can be beneficial when trying to implement this functionality. However, it could be cumbersome when we don't want them to be kept. The filters we've entered must be removed one by one. How can we make it easier to clean these filters? One option would be to add to your web panel a button that implements this functionality. Basically, you'll need this button to perform three functions: empty the variables used for the filters, empty the web session type variable, and refresh the grid. To do this, we'll drag a control of the button type to the web panel and name it Reset Filters. Next, we'll double-click on the button and it'll take us to program its event. As we've said, the first feature we'll need is to empty the variables used for the filters. To do this, we'll apply the setEmpty method to each variable. This way, we'll empty each one of them. Let's try to run it now. We'll enter, for example, the country China, and we'll filter the attractions from A to J. Now we click on the Reset Filters button, and we note that the filters are empty, but the grid is not updated. This is because the grid has not been ordered to be updated. How do we do this? We need to add, within the button event, the refresh method to the grid we want to update. In this case, grid attraction. We run it again and try to enter values in the filters, and then click on the Reset Filters button. We note that it now works properly and updates the grid as desired. We've seen how the pattern work with implements the functionality to save the values of the variables that impact the grid. They are the order applied to the grid, the values of the editable filter fields, and the page number corresponding to the grid. Also, we compared this solution with the one we made in our own way, which was proposed in the first video explaining the differences between them. And finally, we made changes in our web panel using subroutines to explain its operation and understand its use, as well as the work with. Feel free to visit our wiki to learn more about the topics discussed.